They came from halfway across the world, and within months, they had done what no American unit could manage. The jungle was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the suffocating kind that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder. Somewhere in those green walls, the Viet Cong were watching. They always were. This was their domain, their home, their killing ground. For years, American soldiers had learned this the hard way. You could have the best weapons, the most advanced technology, unlimited air support. None of it mattered when you couldn't see your enemy, when every tree could hide a sniper, when every trail could lead to an ambush, when the very ground beneath your feet might explode without warning. But in 1965, a different kind of soldier arrived in Vietnam. They wore different uniforms, they spoke a different language, and they understood something that would change the course of countless battles in that war. They didn't try to conquer the jungle. They became part of it. The ghosts who walked backwash heat in the central highlands could break a man before the enemy ever saw him. 100 degrees at noon. Humidity so thick you could drown in the air itself. American patrols moved through this environment carrying 60, sometimes 70 pounds of equipment, radio batteries, ammunition, rations sealed in cans, extra water because the streams couldn't be trusted. The Viet Cong traveled light. A rifle, a handful of rice, maybe a hammock. They could move 20 miles through terrain that would cripple a conventional infantry unit. They knew which plants you could eat, which water you could drink, where to find shelter when the monsoon rains turned the jungle into a vertical ocean. This was asymmetric warfare in its purest form. One side had everything except the ability to use it effectively. The other side had almost nothing except the knowledge of exactly how to survive and fight in an environment designed to kill outsiders. The Americans adapted slowly. They learned. They tried. Some units became genuinely skilled at jungle warfare, but they were always fighting against their own doctrine, their own supply chains, their own assumptions about how war should be fought. Then the Australians arrived. Most people don't know they were there. When you think about Vietnam, you think about American soldiers, Vietnamese civilians, the North Vietnamese Army, the Viet Cong. The Australian involvement gets mentioned in footnotes, if it's mentioned at all. But the Viet Cong knew they were there, and they learned to fear them in ways they never feared conventional American units. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam arrived first in 1962. Then came the combat battalions. Eventually, over 60,000 Australian personnel would serve in Vietnam, not a massive force compared to the American deployment, but concentrated in ways that created impact far beyond their numbers. They were assigned to Phuoc Province, southeast of Saigon. Thick jungle, dense rubber plantations, Viet Cong strongholds that had existed since the war against the French, the kind of territory where ambushes happened daily, and you measured success by how many of your men made it back alive. What the Australians did there became legendary among those who studied unconventional warfare, but the story of how they did it starts with a single tactical decision. That seemed almost insane at the time. The pattern that saved lives of every military in history has developed patterns, ways of doing things that become so ingrained they're almost unconscious. You set up camp a certain way. You conduct patrols on a certain schedule. You establish defensive positions using certain principles that have been proven over decades of warfare. The Viet Cong studied these patterns the way a hunter studies the habits of prey. American units would establish fire bases with predictable defensive perimeters. They'd send out patrols at regular intervals, often at the same times each day. They'd use the same trails because those trails were mapped and relatively clear. When they set up ambushes, they'd do it by the book, with overlapping fields of fire and clear command structures. All of this made perfect sense according to military doctrine. These were proven methods refined through to world wars and Korea, except they were proven in conventional warfare, where both sides operated under similar assumptions. The Viet Cong operated under completely different assumptions. They would watch a firebase for weeks, count the patrols, time them, learn when the guards were most alert and when fatigue started to set in. They'd find the paths of least resistance, the gaps in the coverage, the moments of transition when one guard shift replaced another. Then they'd strike with devastating precision. The Australian approach was different from the very first day. They understood something fundamental that would take American forces years to fully internalize. In unconventional warfare, predictability is death. When Australian units moved through the jungle, they never used the same path twice if they could help it. When they set up patrol bases, they varied the locations constantly. They didn't patrol on schedules. They'd go out at noon one day, 2 in the morning the next. Sometimes they'd set up as if preparing for a night patrol, then remain completely still in position for 12 hours instead. But the truly revolutionary tactic was something they called walking backwards. Here's how it worked. An Australian patrol would move through the jungle in the normal direction toward their objective. They'd make no particular effort to hide their trail. Then, at a certain point, they would literally turn around and walk backwards in their own footsteps for several hundred meters. Then they'd move perpendicular to their original path, sometimes through water to hide their tracks, and set up an ambush position. The Viet Cong would find the trail. They'd follow it, expecting to ambush the patrol from behind. Instead, they'd walk directly into Australian guns. The first time this happened, the Viet Cong unit was decimated. They couldn't understand what had gone wrong. The tracks were clear. The trail was obvious. But somehow, the Australians had been behind them the entire time. It happened again and again. Asterisk what the jungle taught them. The Australians didn't invent these tactics in Vietnam. They brought something with them that gave them an almost unfair advantage in jungle warfare. Experience that went back generations. Australia had fought its own unconventional wars. In Papua New Guinea during World War II, Australian soldiers had battled the Japanese through some of the most hostile jungle terrain on Earth. The Kokoda Track campaign became legendary for its brutality. No roads, no vehicles, just men carrying everything on their backs through mountainous jungle, fighting an enemy who had adapted to jungle warfare. The Australians learned from that experience in ways that became institutional knowledge. They developed jungle warfare training schools. They studied indigenous peoples who lived in tropical environments. They created doctrines specifically for fighting in conditions where conventional military advantages became liabilities. When they arrived in Vietnam, they were already fluent in the language the jungle spoke. They understood about noise discipline in ways that went beyond simply being quiet. In the jungle, sound travels strangely. A whisper can carry 100 meters in the right conditions. The click of a rifle's safety can give away a position. The Australians learned to communicate with hand signals, developed specifically for low visibility environments. They learned to move through vegetation without disturbing it in ways that would be visible hours later. They understood camouflage not as something you put on, but as something you become. American soldiers often wore standard-issue fatigues and applied camouflage paint in patterns from a manual. Australian soldiers would spend hours preparing for a patrol, customizing their gear with vegetation from the specific area they'd be operating in. They'd even rub mud and crushed leaves on their weapons to kill the smell of gun oil. Most critically, they understood patience. American doctrine emphasized aggressive action. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with overwhelming firepower. This worked beautifully in conventional warfare. In the jungle, it often meant walking into prepared killing zones. The Australians would spend days just watching. A patrol might move into an area, establish a concealed position, and then simply observe for 72 hours. They'd map enemy movements, count personnel, identify patterns. Only then would they strike, and when they did, it was surgical. Asterisk, there's a documented case from 1966 that illustrates this perfectly. An Australian Special Air Service patrol was inserted deep into a known Viet Cong operational area. Their mission was reconnaissance. For 6 days, they remained almost completely motionless in a concealed position. Observing a trail junction, they counted over 100 Viet Cong moving through that junction. They noted weapon types, supply loads, directions of travel. They built a complete intelligence picture of enemy operations in that sector. On the 7th day, They called in airstrikes on 3 separate locations based on what they'd learned. The strikes hit enemy supply caches and staging areas the Viet Cong thought were completely secure. The Viet Cong never knew they were being watched. The villages where nobody spoke of Vietnam War was never just about military tactics. At its core, it was a war for the support of the population. The Viet Cong understood this instinctively. They'd been fighting for decades, first against the French, then against the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. They knew that controlling the villages meant controlling the countryside, and controlling the countryside meant eventually winning the war. American strategy struggled with this reality. The Strategic Hamlet Program tried to isolate villages from Viet Cong influence. By literally moving entire populations into fortified settlements, it created resentment and rarely worked. Search and destroy operations would sweep through an area, engage the enemy, then leave. The Viet Cong would return the next week. The Australian approach in Phuoc To Province was different in ways. That reflected a deeper understanding of counterinsurgency. They didn't just patrol through villages. They lived near them. They provided medical care. They helped with agriculture. They learned Vietnamese. This wasn't charity or propaganda. It was calculated strategy based on a simple principle. If the villagers trusted you, they'd tell you where the Viet Cong were. If they feared the Viet Cong more than they trusted you, they'd tell you nothing. Building that trust took time and consistency. The Australians had both. Unlike American units that rotated frequently, Australian battalions would stay in the same operational area for extended periods. The same faces, the same units. The villagers learned to recognize them. But there was another element to this that was more subtle and more important. The Australians understood that in many villages, everyone knew where the Viet Cong were. The question wasn't knowledge. The question was whether telling you would get them killed after you left. So they didn't ask directly. They'd talk about harvests, about water buffalo, about children. They'd provide medical care without interrogation. They'd help repair damage from fighting without demanding information in return. And slowly, over months, people would start to talk. A woman would mention that her son hadn't been home in 3 months. An old man would casually note that strange people had been using a particular trail at night. A child would draw attention to fresh footprints near the village well. None of it was direct intelligence. All of it was valuable. The Australians would piece together these fragments into operational intelligence. That was often more accurate than anything obtained through formal interrogation. They'd know which areas to avoid because the Viet Cong were waiting. They'd know which areas to focus on because enemy activity was increasing. There's a story from 1967 that shows how effective this became. An Australian patrol was preparing to move through a rubber plantation, known to be used by the Viet Cong. An elderly Vietnamese man approached one of the Australian officers and asked for medical supplies. During the conversation, he mentioned that rubber tappers had been avoiding certain sections of the plantation. For the past week, the Australians changed their route. When they later conducted aerial reconnaissance of the area the man had mentioned, they discovered evidence of a prepared ambush position that could have decimated the patrol. The man had never said there was an ambush. He talked about rubber tappers, but the Australians understood the language of what wasn't being said directly. This created a situation the Viet Cong found increasingly difficult to counter. Their primary advantage had always been invisibility. They could hide among the population, strike from concealment, disappear before overwhelming force could be brought against them. But if the population was quietly providing information about their movements, that invisibility started to crack. The battle nobody expected. August 18th, 1966, Long Tan Rubber Plantation. The monsoon had been hammering the province for 3 days, turning the red soil into thick mud and reducing visibility to a few meters in the driving rain. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was on a patrol sweep. 108 men moving through the plantation in extended formation. They were looking for enemy forces that had attacked the Australian base at Nui Dat 2 days earlier with mortar fire. What they found was an entire enemy force preparing for a major assault. The initial contact seemed routine. A small group of Viet Cong fighters engaged the Australian point section, then withdrew. Standard harassment tactics. The company commander, Major Harry Smith, made a decision that would define the battle. Instead of breaking contact and returning to base, he pursued. This violated conventional wisdom. You don't pursue in terrain that favors the enemy. You don't move toward contact when you're outnumbered. You call in artillery, air support, reinforcements. Then you advance with overwhelming force. But Smith understood something about the Viet Cong that changed his calculation. If they were withdrawing, they were likely drawing the Australians into an ambush. But if the Australians could identify and hit that ambush position before it was fully set, they might disrupt something much larger. He was right. And wrong. And right again in ways that wouldn't become clear for hours. The company pushed forward through the rain. The rubber trees stood in neat rows, providing some cover but channeling movement in predictable directions. Visibility was terrible. Communication was difficult. Every instinct said to pull back. Then they hit the main enemy force, not a company, not a battalion, an entire regiment. Over 2,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong main force fighters, all preparing for a coordinated attack on the Australian base. D Company had walked into the staging area for that attack, and now they were surrounded. When everything goes wrong, the first few minutes of the Battle of Long Tan were chaos in its purest form. Australian soldiers found themselves in contact with enemy forces on three sides. The rain was so heavy that artillery support was questionable. Air cover was grounded. Radio communication was breaking up. By every tactical measure, D Company should have been destroyed in the first hour. They were outnumbered roughly 20-1. They had no armor support, no air support, limited ammunition. The enemy had machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles. But they had something the enemy force wasn't prepared for. Training in jungle warfare that emphasized small unit cohesion and individual initiative. When radio communication became unreliable, section leaders didn't wait for orders. They maneuvered independently, using the rubber trees for cover, creating interlocking fields of fire without central coordination. When ammunition ran low, they redistributed it efficiently, with soldiers carrying rounds to where they were most needed. Most importantly, they didn't panic. Panic is what kills surrounded units. The instinct to run, to break formation, to save yourself when the situation seems hopeless. The Australians had drilled for exactly this scenario. Not theoretically, practically. Hours and hours of training in how to maintain unit cohesion under devastating fire. They formed a defensive perimeter and held it. When the enemy attacked from one direction, they shifted fire without creating gaps elsewhere. When North Vietnamese soldiers got within meters of Australian positions, they used grenades and bayonets. Some sections reported hand-to-hand fighting in the rain and mud. Artillery support began to arrive, called in by forward observers who were estimating positions because visibility was so poor. Some shells landed close enough to Australian positions that soldiers were hit by shrapnel from their own side. But the artillery created a barrier, making it harder for enemy reinforcements to close the perimeter. After the fighting continued for hours. Ammunition got so low that some Australian soldiers were down to fewer than 10 rounds. Medical supplies were exhausted. Men were using torn uniforms as bandages. The situation was desperate. Then the armored personnel carriers arrived. A relief force had fought its way through to the battle, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and the psychological boost of knowing they weren't alone. The enemy force began to disengage, withdrawing into the jungle with their wounded. When the battle ended, D Company had held their position. 18 Australian soldiers were dead, 24 wounded. The enemy left behind over 100 confirmed dead on the battlefield, with intelligence later suggesting total casualties exceeded 500. 108 men had fought off a force 20 times their size and survived. What the numbers don't tell you. Battle of Long Tan became famous, but fame obscures the deeper lesson of what happened that day. This wasn't a story about heroism, though there was heroism. It wasn't about superior firepower, because the Australians were outgunned. It wasn't about luck, though they were lucky the rain lifted enough for artillery to be effective. It was about training so thorough that it became instinct, about tactical doctrine designed specifically for the kind of warfare Vietnam demanded, about small unit leaders who could make decisions without waiting for orders, because they understood the principles underlying those orders. The North Vietnamese army learned something at Long Tan that changed how they engaged Australian forces. These weren't typical foreign soldiers who relied on overwhelming firepower and helicopter support. These were fighters who understood jungle warfare at a fundamental level. After Long Tan, Viet Cong and NVA commanders began advising their units to avoid direct engagement with Australian patrols when possible. There are captured documents that specifically mention the Australians as particularly dangerous adversaries. One document translated after the war described Australian tactics as similar to our own methods. That was perhaps the highest compliment the enemy could give. The Viet Cong had spent decades perfecting jungle warfare. They'd defeated the French colonial army. They'd frustrated the Americans. And now they were acknowledging that the Australians had learned to fight the way they fought. But the Australian success in Vietnam wasn't just about tactics. It was about something more fundamental that American strategy often missed. The one thing that changed everything are won by many factors: logistics, strategy, political will, technology, training. All of these matter, but in Vietnam, there was one factor that mattered more than almost anything else: understanding that you were fighting a different kind of war. The Americans often tried to fight Vietnam as if it were World War II, with jungles instead of European fields. They measured success in body counts and territory controlled. They used massive firepower to compensate for the difficulty of finding the enemy. They rotated soldiers in and out on one-year tours, which meant units were constantly losing experienced personnel just as they were becoming effective. The Australians understood from the beginning that Vietnam required a fundamentally different approach. Not just different tactics, but different strategic thinking. They didn't focus on body counts. They focused on denying the enemy the ability to operate freely. They didn't try to control all the territory. They focused on controlling the population centers and making the surrounding jungle too dangerous for large enemy formations. They didn't rotate individuals. They rotated entire units, maintaining cohesion and accumulated knowledge. Most importantly, they recognized that they weren't going to win the war militarily. They could win battles. They could make specific areas secure. They could inflict heavy casualties on enemy forces. But winning the war required political solutions that were beyond their control. This might seem like a defeatist attitude, but it was actually liberating. It meant they focused on what they could control: protecting the population in their operational area, gathering intelligence, disrupting enemy operations, and inflicting maximum casualties while minimizing their own losses. They were effective at all of these things. Phuoc to Province became one of the more secure areas of South Vietnam. During the Australian deployment, Viet Cong activity decreased significantly. Village populations that had been terrorized began to feel safer. The province capital, Ba Rua, went from a contested area to relatively secure. But the larger war didn't care about one province. The political will in the United States was eroding. The South Vietnamese government remained corrupt and unpopular. The North Vietnamese were willing to absorb casualties that would have been politically unacceptable to any Western democracy, and the fundamental question of whether South Vietnam was a viable nation-state remained unanswered. The Australians withdrew in 1972. The Americans withdrew in 1973. Saigon fell in 1975. All that tactical brilliance, all those battles won, all those villages secured, ultimately couldn't change the trajectory of a war that was being lost at strategic and political levels that had nothing to do with who was better at jungle fighting. The lessons written in Silent Sether, a memorial in Canberra dedicated to Australian service in Vietnam. It lists the names of over 500 Australians who died in that war. Thousands more came home wounded, physically or psychologically or both. For years after the war, Australia didn't want to talk about Vietnam. The soldiers who served there faced hostility or indifference. The tactical lessons they'd learned were studied in military academies. But the broader public moved on. Vietnam became a political debate, not a military history, but within military circles. The Australian experience in Vietnam became a case study in effective counterinsurgency and jungle warfare. The tactics developed in Phuoc to province were analyzed, refined, and incorporated into training programs around the world. The concept of walking backwards became part of standard patrol techniques in asymmetric warfare. The emphasis on building relationships with local populations became central to counterinsurgency doctrine. The Americans, too, learned from their Australian allies. Special Operations Forces studied Australian methods. The emphasis on small unit tactics and individual initiative influenced how elite units trained. The recognition that conventional force wasn't always the answer to unconventional threats became more widely accepted. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Australian experience in Vietnam is one that military forces still struggle with today. You can win every battle and still lose the war if the strategic and political foundations aren't solid. The Australians were extraordinary at what they did. They adapted to the environment. They learned to fight the enemy on his own terms and win. They protected the populations they were assigned to secure. They inflicted disproportionate casualties on enemy forces, while suffering relatively light losses themselves. None of it was enough to change the outcome of the war. This isn't a criticism of Australian soldiers. It's a recognition that wars are complex systems where tactical excellence is necessary, but not sufficient. You need strategy that makes sense, politics that can be sustained, a cause that populations will support. Without these elements, even the best tactical performance becomes a footnote in a larger story of failure. Where the story's end, jungle has reclaimed most of the battlefields now. Long Tan is a rubber plantation again, with a memorial cross marking where D Company made their stand. The fire bases have been dismantled. The trails have grown over. Nature doesn't preserve battlefields the way open terrain does, but the people who were there remember. Australian veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, carry memories of heat and rain and fear and the strange camaraderie that comes from shared danger. Vietnamese veterans, too, remember the Australians as different from the Americans. More dangerous in some ways, more respectful in others. There's a strange postscript to the Australian experience in Vietnam that doesn't fit neatly into any narrative. After the war ended, Australia accepted many Vietnamese refugees. Thousands of people who had fought against Australia, or whose family members had, became Australian citizens. Former enemies became neighbours. Some Australian veterans struggled with this, others embraced it. There are documented cases of Australian soldiers who fought at Long Tan, later becoming friends with North Vietnamese soldiers who fought in that same battle. They'd meet decades later and share memories of that terrible day, finding common ground in the simple fact that they'd both survived something horrific. War creates enemies. Time sometimes creates something more complex. Asterisk the truth behind the legend. So, what does it mean to say the Australians beat the Viet Cong at their own game? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than it sounds. They didn't beat the Viet Cong strategically. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army ultimately achieved their objective, reunifying Vietnam under communist control. No amount of tactical success by Australian forces changed that outcome. But tactically, in specific engagements in particular operational areas, the Australians consistently outperformed expectations. They fought enemy forces on terrain that favoured those enemies, using methods adapted from those same enemies, and achieved results that were often stunning. They proved that foreign forces could adapt to jungle warfare, that conventional soldiers could learn unconventional tactics, that respecting the environment and the population mattered as much as firepower, that patience and observation could be more powerful than aggressive action. Most importantly, they proved that there's no such thing as an unbeatable enemy. The Viet Cong and NVA were formidable fighters with home field advantage and political commitment. That sustained them through enormous casualties. But they weren't invincible. They could be outmaneuvered, outfought, and defeated in specific engagements when facing soldiers who understood the environment and adapted accordingly. The tragedy is that tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic incoherence. The war was unwinnable not because the Viet Cong couldn't be beaten in battle, but because winning battles wasn't enough to achieve the political objectives that justified the war in the first place. Asterisk what remains the Vietnam War ended half a century ago. The soldiers who fought there are aging. Soon, there will be no living veterans to tell first-hand stories about what happened in those jungles. The history will become entirely documentary, preserved in films and photographs and written accounts, but the lessons remain relevant. Every conflict since Vietnam has involved some element of asymmetric warfare. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. The challenges are remarkably similar. Conventional forces trying to fight enemies who don't wear uniforms, who hide among civilian populations, who use terrain and tactics that negate technological advantages. The Australian experience in Vietnam offers a template, though not a solution. There are no solutions to the fundamental problem of trying to achieve political objectives through military force when the population doesn't support those objectives. But there are better and worse ways to fight. The Australians showed the better way. Adapt to the environment. Respect the population. Focus on what you can control. Train thoroughly. Fight smart rather than hard. Accept that tactical excellence has limits. These aren't revolutionary insights. They're common sense. But common sense is remarkably uncommon in warfare, where institutional momentum and political pressure often override tactical wisdom. The memorial in Canberra lists names. Each name represents a life cut short, a family that grieved, potential unfulfilled. The memorial doesn't celebrate victory because there was no victory to celebrate. It acknowledges service. It recognizes sacrifice. It reminds visitors that wars have costs that transcend strategic outcomes. The soldiers who served in Vietnam, Australian and American and Vietnamese, all paid those costs in different ways. Some paid with their lives, some with their bodies, some with their peace of mind. All of them did what soldiers do, followed orders, tried to survive, protected the people beside them, and hoped it meant something. Whether it meant something remains a question without a clear answer. The war was lost. The cause failed. But the courage was real. The sacrifice was real. The lessons learned were real. And somewhere in that complexity lies the truth about what the Australians accomplished in Vietnam. They didn't change the outcome of the war, but they showed it was possible to fight with intelligence and adaptation and respect, even in the worst circumstances. They proved that learning from your enemy isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That's not the heroic narrative wars usually produce. It's something more subtle and perhaps more valuable. It's a reminder that even in failure, there can be excellence, that doing difficult things well matters, even when those things aren't enough. The jungle keeps its secrets now. The battles are history. But the lesson remains in any conflict on any terrain against any enemy. The side that adapts most effectively to reality has the best chance of surviving. Not winning, necessarily, but surviving. Sometimes survival is its own kind of victory. The Australians understood that. They fought accordingly. And decades later, military forces around the world still study what they did in the jungles of Vietnam, learning from soldiers who became ghosts in the green hell and lived to tell about it.